panel subject is China, 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 and it's about China. We have the good luck of appearing with you immediately after the summit between Xi Jinping and President Obama, in which cyber was really the central deliverable, the central news event. You heard President Obama summarize this understanding between the two countries about commercial espionage. The pledge that neither country's government will conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property. So I want to begin by asking the panel to dig down on that pledge. Jim Lewis was quoted by David Sanger in the New York Times immediately after saying, "This is significant and it's measurable. We can count the number of commercial espionage cases." I want to ask each of you to explore that. Is this for real? How will it be enforced? What concerns do you have? And let's start with John Carlin, who is our senior National Security law enforcement officer in this area. John.
Well, thanks for having us here today, and it is timely. I think this is a significant moment. And what you've seen is that we're in the midst of a transformation as to how we handle this threat against U.S. companies and U.S. victims. What we've had is a transformation going on in the Department of Justice where, for a long period of time, even the cyber-enabled activity that targeted private companies and took commercial secrets, trade secrets, negotiation strategies, and then used it against them in business was treated as something on the intelligence side of the house. When I was over at the FBI working for Director Mueller, we put a lot of resources into getting better at watching what was happening. But what we were watching was horrifying, and as the president recently said at the summit, it's an act of aggression that has to stop, because this isn't traditional intelligence, it's theft. It's causing real harm day in and day out to thousands of American businesses, costing billions of dollars. And our determination to stop that and treat it as theft is what led to the indictment, the first of its kind, of the 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, Unit 61398, where we laid out in meticulous detail their theft against a range of American industry, from nuclear to solar to steel, from management side to labor side. And what they were stealing were not secrets for general strategic purposes or national security purposes. They were stealing business negotiation strategies. At the same time they were trying to buy something, they would instead steal it. Theft. And when we did that, there were some who said, China will never get it. This is, they're never going to understand that this is theft. That's an American value. Why would you use the criminal system? And there were some, Jim Lewis included, who said, no, this is a matter of will, national will, to say the status quo is unacceptable. We need to bring this back into the realm of deterrence like we do with other acts of theft or aggression, and use all of the tools, including the criminal justice system, but also all of the tools, Treasury, Commerce, State Department, to keep increasing the cost of this theft and aggression until the behavior stops. So what was significant, I think, here is you had, although some said they would never get it, and now the president of China, President Xi, disagrees. He has said, we do get it. It is theft when you do commercially enabled taking of these, when you do cyber-enabled taking of commercial secrets. That does not mean that the battle is done or that we can't continue to raise the cost for this activity, but it does mean the next time that we take an enforcement action, there will be no debate as to whether what occurred was wrong or not. So that norm is set. And having China, of all countries, do it, I think, was particularly important because it sends a message to all of the world that this is clearly behavior that is outside the pale.
General Davis, you advise companies whose secrets are being plundered. I assume they're among your clients. What are you going to tell them after this agreement? How are you going to advise them to interpret it? When they ask you, when the CEO says, General Davis, is this for real? What are you going to say?
Yeah. First, David, thank you. It's an honor to be here with you and these two gentlemen. Let me give you an answer from the private sector perspective, and then let me also give you a little bit of an answer from a previous national security professional perspective. I'd answer, this is fundamentally different than we've seen before. I'm excited about this, but it's no excuse to let your guard down. We're still going to have to measure action, like the president said. It's a statement. It has to be followed by action. Private sector plays a significant role in measuring those actions. I believe contributes to part of a broader team. I do believe that this was a result, and this is very different. They usually don't even admit to anything. When they do, they say there's no distinction between traditional espionage and corporate espionage, and then they turn around and traditionally use Snowden to say we're hypocrites in talking about the issue. This is very different, so that's why I'm excited about it. As a former national security professional, let me just say the other two parts of this agreement really excite me even more, because the thing that the DoD has traditionally been trying to do with China is establish better transparency, reduce the amount of uncertainty, control escalation, and reduce the chance of making a mistake. So establishing procedures for talking about what's happening in this environment and engaging China in this discussion of what does responsible behavior look like, norms of responsible behavior, to me as a former national security professional, that's especially exciting.
Jim Lewis, what would be your assessment? You talked in the quote I read from the New York Times about this being significant and measurable. General Davis said it's measurable, but really by the private sector. How's that going to work? I mean, how are we going to keep a scorecard to see whether the Chinese are living up to what they've promised in this agreement?
Well, David, as you know better than most, every agreement that's been made since the Washington Naval Convention of 1922, all the way down to Iran, it's always greeted with cries that they're going to cheat and they won't comply and they'll be backsliding. And the answer is, yeah, there'll be backsliding and it'll be hard for them to get compliance. It's not like President Xi can go back to Beijing and there's a switch on the wall and he flicks it down and hacking ends. But we can now, because of improved capabilities in both FBI and in NSA, count, not perfectly, but count the number of incidents. And this is pretty easy. If the number of incidents stays steady or goes up, it's not working. If it goes down, which is what we all hope, then it is working. It was significant for the Chinese who, as John said, routinely in public denied any knowledge of this and in private said, look, it's legitimate for us to do this kind of commercial espionage, right? It helps our national security. This is a big change for them. We will need to keep the pressure on, though, to get the results of the breakthrough.
And why, just to follow up, why did they do this? It does mark a change in behavior. John Carlin said it's in part a result of our actually moving to prosecute them. Well, why do you think they did it?
You know, one thing that people don't recognize, and I think both the Johns understood this, the indictments played a crucial role. The Chinese hated the indictments. And so people said, well, they'll never come to trial. It's a waste of time. The Chinese hated the indictments. And they might not be as expert in American law as some of you out in the audience. And so for them, indictment, sanction, they didn't want to go through it again. Also, they were really interested in getting a good outcome from the summit. This was crucial for them. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe it's the economy, maybe it's something else. It fits in with Xi's domestic reform efforts, both with the military and anti-corruption. So it was just the planets lined up for this summit.
So we had an interesting, bracing, what's the way to put it? You know, not a bucket of cold water, at least a big cup that was poured this week by our Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, who knows this area almost as well as our panel. Certainly has been around it for a long time. He was asked in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee this week, did he think that this agreement that we have just been discussing would eliminate cyber attacks from China? And he answered, long pause, no. And he then went on to tell Senator McCain, such malicious cyber activity will continue and probably accelerate until we establish and demonstrate the capability to deter malicious state-sponsored cyber activity. So I want to ask you about deterrence. I'm going to take Secretary Clapper, his prediction, just as a baseline. Let's make that assumption that we continue to monitor some level of attacks. What would a deterrence regime look like? And let me ask you first, John, to talk about that in terms of authorities, in terms of the law, and how the law would apply.
Well, I think we're in the middle of a pivot towards that deterrent regime. And although cyber-enabled activity is a new area, we can look to many of the tools and practical, pragmatic-based practice of national security law that we've used when confronting difficult threats like terrorism, threats against U.S. persons abroad and here in the United States, like the export of weapons of mass destruction and other proliferation to rogue regimes. And what you've seen us use there, I think for a long time, pre-9/11, people thought of national security law, that means international law, or it means only law of armed conflict. And post-9/11, the reason my division was formed was to break down a wall between law enforcement and intelligence and make the practice of national security law looking at what the intelligence shows you the threat is, and then as lawyers, looking across every legal authority that we have and picking strategically what tool you use in the tool book to cause the maximum amount of disruption that you can to the adversary. And this is an easier area to do it in when it comes to commercially driven theft, because it is truly a dollars and cents proposition where if we can increase the cost, deny them the benefits, behavior will change, like other types of theft. So what does that look like? I think the name of this panel is China, 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 but our response to China has to also be driven by Iran, North Korea, Russia. The world is watching how we handle these issues. And so that's another reason why it was important not to leave the criminal justice system off the table, because that was sending an accidental signal of its own. No one decided to do that. That was partly because we just weren't looking to make these cases, and we were assuming that it was intel. But we were creating essentially an easement that says, walk across our lawn, there's no consequence. So bring that tool to the table. Number two, we now have an executive order in place that allows the punishment of cyber-enabled activity by, and in particular, it allows you to levy sanctions against the beneficiaries of stolen trade secrets. That's the type of tool we've had in place and used when it comes to terrorism and export. We also have Commerce Department's authority to designate certain entities as ones that damage the national security so they can't do business, and American businesses can't do business with that designated entity. That causes real pain, actual economic cost, which is what you need. And you also are seeing USTR explore the option of whether you could bring a WTO action if you show this pattern and practice of theft. I'm giving you a range of options because this is the type of national security threat. Maybe it falls short of the definition of armed conflict, but that doesn't mean, number one, that it's not a national security threat, and number two, that we can't use a range of legal authorities to deter. And I think you heard the president be very clear and very strong on this in his remarks, because he didn't agree to stop doing anything as a part of this agreement. They agreed that it's theft, and he said, the president, that we reserve the right to take a responsive action at a time and place of our choosing. So I do think it's important to continue to show that we can deter, and that means doing three things. Stop there, but one, we need to be able to do the investigation and attribution to figure out who did it, and we can. It's hard, but I think for a while people thought you could remain anonymous and we couldn't do it. Number two, when we do figure out who did it, we have to show that we're not afraid to say it. And number three, once we figure out who did it, we're not afraid to say it, there has to be a consequence. And that can range depending on the actor. But you saw us apply that new approach, not just in the PLA case, but in Sony, when it came to quickly figuring out it was North Korea, saying it was North Korea, and then using an executive order to levy sanctions against North Korea. And I think it is precisely because China, in part, saw we are marching down this deterrence path, and that we had a true will to use executive order to bring sanctions, that we saw them start to change their cost-benefit analysis. But it won't stop there. We have to follow through with action if activity continues against U.S. companies.
So, General Davis, John Carlin is describing deterrence as a series of essentially legal moves, sanctions, public discussion and blaming. When I think of deterrence, having grown up in the Cold War, I think of the threat to retaliate in kind. And essentially, that kind of deterrence means if we detect you're hitting our cyber targets, our companies through cyber attack that we can attribute, we're going to retaliate in kind. We're going to vaporize your networks. It's hard for our Assistant Attorney General to speak to that, but you're in the private sector now. What do you think about that more kind of traditional kind of deterrence? You hit us, we're going to hit you just as hard.
Yeah. David, first, let me, John used a term that I think is very important, cyber activities. Malicious cyber activities, there's a wide range of activities. They're not all attacks. Criminal activity is very different from political hacktivism, is very different from espionage, is different from more disruptive and destructive type of activities. So there's a wide range, and I think that matters greatly in the discussion. You can't just lump it all into the term cyber attacks. But in terms of deterrence, I agree with the Assistant Attorney General. I think there has to be a wide range, a very comprehensive approach to this. And you can't just look at one tool, you know, for one solution. I think intelligence indications and warning are extremely important. It's an extremely important tool in overall deterrence by naming names. And our intelligence community has invested a significant amount of time and energy in developing those capabilities for a variety of reasons, one of which can be and has been used in a comprehensive deterrent role. There are protection and defenses, and that's where I believe both government and private sector play a significant role in raising the cost of being able to accomplish whatever an adversary might want to accomplish, criminal or nation state. There are resilience and recovery capabilities that are part of deterrence, so that no matter what you do, you can brush it off. It's not going to be catastrophic to either a private sector's goals and objectives or a government's goals and objectives. The final portion of the comprehensive deterrence strategy involves response. And that's, in my view, that's where the government has the leading role. And our government, when I was involved in the discussion of what the policy was, it was a whole of government approach. And it was based on using all the levers of national power that we had at our disposal. The military certainly is one of those elements of national power. And but you better believe that the military cyber capabilities that we are developing now they will always develop options for senior governmental decision making as to whether or not that's the appropriate tool to use based on the context of the situation. Largely, we have limited our capability to use those tools because we live in a glass house, because the consequence of us using that when you know, our private sector is at risk, until we achieve a better cybersecurity posture as a nation, and this is even greater than our nation, this is an international issue, until we achieve a greater cybersecurity posture, I think we're going to be limited in the amount of tools that we have on the more serious end of the equation, such as military responses. But I agree that a comprehensive approach is really the only way to treat the issue of deterrence. And one other aspect, just from a military perspective, you're seeing a lot more transparency now about what the military is doing, why it's doing it, the missions for these forces. That's a very deliberate approach by the Defense Department in DoD's new cyber strategy to talk about this, because once you begin to show a little bit more light on what the military is doing, there's a practical reason for doing that. And that is, you can now begin to use that in a deterrence role.
To let people know what we could do if we ever chose to respond. So, Jim, I'd love to hear your thoughts about deterrence. And maybe you could speak to the case of the Sony hack which was fascinating in that the United States, despite what was said in news accounts, were real intelligence problems with disclosing how we could attribute this attack to North Korea. The decision was made to go ahead nonetheless. Do you share General Davis's concern about not moving into more active, direct deterrence, going after other people's systems when our own systems are vulnerable?
You know, I love discussions of deterrence because for me it's a form of ancestor worship, so it's really a lot of fun to. But I do have a newsflash: the Cold War is over. Why I have to keep saying that, I don't know. And so the points that were made earlier, that what we're really talking about is changing an opponent's calculus of the risks and benefits of a cyber action. And until recently, really until the indictments, there were almost no penalties, right, for doing something bad. And Sony was a deliberate effort to say, we have the ability to determine. I'm not sure, I know there's a sources and methods concerns. If you're curious, it's on page 748 of the Snowden leaks. You can figure out how we did it. But it was a benefit to tell the world, we have improved our attribution capabilities. You're not invisible anymore. It's beneficial to think of a range of actions that could create penalties for an opponent. One of the big debates now is, what is a proportional response? Is it sanctions? Is it a military action? Is it something else? And I think we will have to have that proportional response debate, because it's not, you know, they invade Europe, we use nukes. It's much more complicated, and it will be difficult to get there. But Sony was really helpful because we saw a series of actions that suggested that some of our opponents, China, Iran, North Korea, had decided that the risk of doing things to US companies was low. And I think what happened with Sony helped change their mind. Words can be important in this too. We don't want to devalue the agreement. The fact that the Chinese now in their calculus have to remember that their president made a commitment, that changes opponent calculations.
I just would note, since we're talking about deterrence, recollection for somebody who covered many of these Cold War debates. There evolved a distinction between countervalue targeting, which basically meant if you hit our population, we'll wipe out, you know, tens, hundreds of millions of your population. But that was seen as unrealistic. So a big strategic change was the development of counter-force targeting, which was specifically targeted at the other side's military, and in this case, you'd argue the other side's electronic cyber capabilities. And I think, I just throw out, that distinction may have some value as we think about what deterrence might mean in this area. Let me turn finally to the question of, I'm going to call it the glass houses problem. This was referred to again by our blunt-speaking Director of National Intelligence. He was asked about the attack on the OPM personnel records by the Chinese, which was a huge data breach. It said 5 million records, maybe 1 million fingerprints, just enormous scope and potential consequences. And the question was, does this sort of thing fall under the agreement that we have reached with the Chinese not to have commercial espionage against each other? And Director Clapper said, in effect, no, it doesn't include that. And then I quote him, "We too practice cyber espionage, and we're not bad at it." And he went on to say, "I think it's a good idea to at least think about the old saw about people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw rocks." This infuriated Senator McCain and led to a very lively back and forth. But I want to ask each of you, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Robert Work, has said if there's another OPM attack, we'll retaliate. But I hear Jim Clapper saying, not so fast. John Carlin, how do you look at this question of the line between espionage and commercial espionage, and how you think our government should walk that line?
I can break it into different categories. And one that now I think should be universally accepted, thanks to what just occurred, is that targeting a company for just the purpose of stealing their information so you can use it against them in business is wrong. And that's a principle as old as the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal. And we had been saying that, but there was a debate until now. So hopefully that's going to be established as a principle. Does that mean people stop stealing? Stealing is also as old as the 10 Commandments. But when we catch people doing it, we prosecute them. We look to punish them, and people don't say, why are you doing that? It's understood. So that needs to be a norm in this space. Secondly, and it's in my division, in addition to doing terrorism cases, we prosecute spies. Every country in the world openly, almost every country in the world openly has an intelligence service. The idea of it gathering intelligence to protect one's national security is actually a principle recognized in international law. But when you get caught, people also know that we're going to prosecute you as a spy. That's one of the consequences for getting caught. So I can see why, for our intelligence professionals, that they don't want to get caught, but they know that there'll be consequences if they get caught, overseas. So as we work out the kind of more complicated question of cyber-enabled espionage for national security purposes, at least from my realm, it always seems strange, the idea, if we catch it, there's going to be consequences. And I go back to that approach, which is one, we need to show that we can catch you in this space, because people thought that you couldn't. And two, say it. That does not necessarily always mean saying it publicly. Sometimes
you're speaking now about category 2, spying. Not commercial, not stealing my company's secrets, stealing my government secrets.
So when we catch people stealing our government secrets, you again look at a range of tools to deter that activity. I think General was exactly right. Some of that is making it harder to do and raising the costs for doing it. Some of it would be if you do something big and embarrassing and you get caught, that there's going to be some type of consequence. Otherwise, we'd have people driving up Mack trucks to our government facilities and piling them up with documents and driving out with the Mack truck. I think everyone knows if we caught you in law enforcement doing that there'd be a consequence. I think it's less kind of black and white than theft is theft, stop hitting our companies, because that, as the president said, is an act of aggression. I also think you can distinguish it from the destructive attacks that I just flew back from giving a speech at SANS. SANS, was the victim of a destructive attack against its computer systems that the Director of National Intelligence has attributed to Iranian-related actors. Sony, another example of a destructive attack designed to change behavior. When it comes to those destructive attacks or theft of information as an act of aggression, that's where I think our policy needs to be clear that we're going to figure out who did it, be very public when we can about who did it, and impose direct consequences. In the espionage world, as you know, as an expert in following these for years, sometimes when you catch a spy, you throw them out of the country. Sometimes they end up in jail. Sometimes it causes a diplomatic, but there usually are some consequence when you catch another country's spying.
General Davis, if you'd speak to this question of spying and the trade-offs involved. In your new world of Silicon Valley, U.S. Technology business, there was high anxiety after the Snowden revelations about the extent to which the U.S. was using intelligence collection tools and the ways in which that put American companies at risk because other countries didn't like having their secrets stolen. What do you think that we should limit our collection so as to protect our companies and our ability to operate abroad? What kind of advice do you give your clients on this?
Well, David, I've just started, so I haven't given any of them advice yet. But yes, this is a difficult thing for industry because of the impact of the Snowden revelations. And let's face it, we in government and we in the private sector want our industry to flourish. We want it to be competitive around the world. We want it to flourish. And so we have to be very careful about these relationships. And I think there's no single answer to this. I think it's something that has to be done within the framework of managing risk from a national security and economic security perspective, managing risk from a business perspective, and I think good leaders will figure that out. But I did want to say that, you know, the idea about this deterrence model and putting consequence to actions, and I agree. Something like the OPM, I'm not surprised. Shame on us for making it so easy, you know? And I think the private sector needs to play and is playing an ever more important role in not just protection and defenses of these kinds of things, but also its own intelligence and attribution capabilities. Significant advancement there. It's not just the intelligence community anymore. The private sector plays a huge role in being able to contribute to that overall team effort at making it more difficult to hide. And so I think that is part of the consequence. Not everything that we see deserves a TLAM in response to it. There needs to be a broad range of things, and that broad range of things includes a very broad public-private partnership.
Jim Lewis, what do you think about the glass house problem?
You know, it's an interesting thing to watch in this agreement as we move forward will be how the PLA reacts. And you probably noticed that right before the summit, there was a case where 2 Chinese fighters buzzed a U.S. patrol plane in international waters. Usually you don't do that right before a summit. That's a little odd. And so what was it? Was it Xi sending a signal to Obama? Was it the PLA sending a signal to Xi? Or was it just the local guy going off the leash? We don't know. So I think watching how the PLA reacts to this, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there'll be a coup or any nonsense like that. Xi is in charge, but he'll need to move out and extend his authority. For us, that means we have to watch the PLA and how the PLA plays by this. In some ways, they were fenced off in this agreement. Espionage was fenced off. We have our own reasons for doing that. The Chinese might like a deal where the PLA is untrammeled, commercial espionage is. That isn't going to work. So we will need to think, not so much that we live in a glass house, but what is the right action to take? And it doesn't have to be throwing a stone. It could be an indictment. It could be a sanction. It could be some sort of public naming. It could be a leak of people's bank account information or their real estate in Los Angeles. We have a lot more options that don't necessarily involve breaking all the glass.
So I want to ask our chairman, Allison, if you have questions that have come in. We have 5 minutes remaining by my watch, and I'd like to use those usefully and involve our audience if we can.
So I have 2 questions. The first one would be to Major General John Davis, I'm sure. Does the military recruit the right people to conduct cyber here in the U.S.? And the second is, and this is a broader one, maybe for all of you, should U.S. corporations be protected by the DoD when it comes to cyber?
Let's start with General Davis on that, and then I'd love to hear the views of the panel as a whole on this interaction between the U.S. government and our private sector as we go forward. It's a very complicated question. Obviously arose in the Snowden case, but General Davis, start off, and then we'll turn to the panel as a whole.
Sure, David. My perspective from my previous life was that getting the human dimension of this right, getting the right kind of people and talent and skills is absolutely the most important job. And I think you heard Secretary Carter say that. His first visit in the United States was to the troops at U.S. Cyber Command. So that said something about, and he mentioned that, I think he used something similar in terms of the priority on people. It's a challenge. I think the clarity that we now have with regard to the missions that the military is required to perform as part of a broader whole of government team enables the military then in each service, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, to figure out what specific types of roles those people have, to bring them in with the right aptitude and to put them on a training program and regime to get them trained and be world-class at what they do. Still going to have to rely on government civilians, still going to have to rely on the private sector significantly for it. I don't think that's going to change, but I do believe the military is on a good path to attracting the right kind of people. I think it's going to be a challenge building this force out. The role of the military and the private sector, very touchy subject, because Once again, it's a whole of government effort. DHS has the lead in terms of interface with the private sector. When it's a criminal matter or national security issue, the FBI has the lead. The military is in a supporting role. The military's primary role is an outward-facing role to counter things that might come in and really do damage. Not the typical criminal stuff, but something that might cause loss of life or prevent a military response or cause economic collapse. That's what the military is building forces to be able to go out and counter that, stop it from happening in the first place, or if it's already happening, reduce the magnitude of it. Not to provide guards for Wall Street. That's not the role of the military.
General, I want to ask the other two panelists to address this question of the interface between government and the private sector, but first I want to ask you about who the NSA should be recruiting at Fort Meade. Do you think the hacking community will be willing to come to work for the government?
My opinion, I think we should get the talent wherever the talent is, but we should be very careful about what kind of talent we're recruiting, because in my opinion, from my previous experience, it's extremely important to have people who are precise, people who respect the rule of law and the chain of command, people who are mentally agile and innovative. And there's a list of qualities that I believe is very important to be successful in this type of environment. That's not always the same set of qualities that make, I used to be an old Ranger. Some of those qualities are similar. Some of them are very different. So I think we just have to be careful about that. But one thing we can't ever sacrifice is the trust and credibility of the forces that are doing some very sensitive things in support of our national security. So we need to be very careful about never undermining that trust and credibility.
Jim Lewis, let me turn to you, and then we'll close with John Carlin. Talk about, in a country where there is an awful lot of mistrust of government, we're getting protections for the defense industrial base, getting clean wires, and having the kind of cooperation that would make that possible has been very tough, where it's tough to get cyber legislation. How do you see the way forward? It's easy to talk about this cooperation. What would you suggest in terms of practical ways to encourage it?
A lot of what we focused on in cybersecurity for the last decade has been on the defensive side, and that companies will harden their networks, agencies will harden their networks. I really like that approach because it reminds me of the Maginot Line, right? It's, well, oh.
And you don't mean that as a compliment.
Well, probably not, probably not. We need to think a little differently, and some of that will be asking, what is the role of the military? And I think being respectful of the constitutional constraints on that, we might need to think of an expanded role, outward-facing perhaps, for DoD. The privacy issue, the surveillance issue has really complicated this debate. And so you need to have a way for the American people to feel confident that if government plays a larger role, that it's doing so in a manner that respects their civil liberties. But I think that's how we have to move forward. International engagement, better thinking about how the military plays, better consequences, including law enforcement consequences for misbehavior, to add on to the sort of domestic point defense approach that we've taken in the past.
So that's a perfect way to turn to John Carlin for final comments. How do you think, how does the Justice Department think about getting that balance right so that a country that's very suspicious, very concerned about its privacy, is able to work in ways that make sense with the government for protections that matter?
So I think we're changing in that this is a different type of threat. And when it came to terrorism, for instance, we went about and did our work in a way that we were notoriously private. And so we weren't doing a lot of outreach, and folks in my position weren't doing a lot of discussions with the private sector. Cyber, as the General and Jim both alluded to, is one where so much of what we value is in private hands, and also the innovation that's taking place is in the private sector. And so it has to be an area where we partner by sharing information. And also, I think the General hit on a key point here, which is it is not a line that one can draw. There's no wall you can build that's high enough or deep enough right now that can keep a determined nation-state adversary out of an internet-connected system. So they can get in if they want to. And that means changing the mentality from one of, can I buy the right product to build the wall, to risk mitigation, as the General alluded to. To talk about risk mitigation, you need CEO, board, and general counsel level attention to figure out what do I value most, how do I protect it, what are the risks that I'm facing in this area. And so you've seen us, we have an outreach program now. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it next week. But to give you an example, next week I'll be at a Vanity Fair event with the CEO of Sony, Michael Linton. Not something that I'm used to doing, or a venue in which the head of national security usually appears. But it's because we're trying to reach an audience that's looking at that's where they get their news, to send this message of, this could happen to you. Risk mitigation is something that needs to apply to you. It's not just something in the defense industrial base. The key incidents we've seen so far are in gaming, entertainment, and against the financial sector, not players that are used to having to figure out how to handle classified information. So outreach now needs to be a part of our job, listening to the concerns that they have on sharing information. I'll put a plug in there. It's just wrong that we have not passed legislation that makes it clear what and how one should share information in this space. That has to change. It seems like both parties agree that it has to change, and now we need to execute, because these incidents occur too quickly for each company to try to discover on its own how to do risk mitigation, what the current threats are. So we need clear guidance as to when they can appropriately share with other companies in their sector, when they can share with the government, and when we can share back.